Hi everyone and welcome to the video. Today I'm going to be discussing James Joyce's Finnegans Wake and giving you a walkthrough of the first chapter. But before that, let's just start by considering the background of Finnegans Wake and why it has such a reputation for being impenetrable. Finnegans Wake is written in a style of dreamspeak that borrows words from all of the languages of the world. So as you can imagine, for most monoglots, this poses an intense problem. In addition to this, Finnegans Wake doesn't contain a linear narrative. In other words, the book doesn't have a coherent beginning and end, and the book was designed to represent a never-ending cycle modeled on the philosophy of Vico. That said, the novel does have some plot, obviously, and this plot largely charts the mental lives in the dreams of the five characters: HCE, the father; ALP, the mother; Issy, the daughter; and Shem and Sean, the two brothers. It's important to note that in the course of the novel, all of the characters take on different dream manifestations. For example, HCE is represented as Adam and ALP is depicted as Eve, and this can make it really difficult for new readers to tell which manifestation is supposed to be which character. Another point is that the novel is largely a dream allegory for Genesis, like the fall of mankind and all of that kind of stuff. Now, there's a lot more that I could mention about Finnegans Wake, but let's just get started with the first chapter, because I want to show that we can have fun with the book and we don't have to go into it acting like we have to understand every subtext that James Joyce has put in, because he worked on Finnegans Wake for 18 years. So one couldn't really understand the book 100% unless one was in the mind of James Joyce. Here we have the first sentence of the book. Now you will notice immediately that it starts mid-sentence, and this actually connects to the last sentence of the book that ends with the word "the." So this represents the cyclic nature of the book. As for the sentence, I'll just read it now and then I'll point out a couple interesting things about it. River run past Eve and Adams, from swerve of shore to bend of bay, brings us by a commodious vicus of recirculation back to Hoath Castle and Inverons. There's a few things we can pick up in this sentence. Firstly, there are several references to the cyclical nature of the book, and these are through the words recirculation, the allusions to circles and cyclical rivers, and there's also the reference to Adam and Eve, and the fact that the first chapter and the book in general is largely an allegory for Genesis. Another thing that I want to point out is the allusion to HCE, the father character of the book, and this is through the words Hoath Castle and Inverons. One thing that you should always keep a lookout for in the book is these three letters, HCE, as well as ALP, because they are an allusion to the main characters of the book, and James Joyce obviously hid a lot of secret messages in the book, such as this. The next sentence refers to the first manifestation of HCE, Sir Tristram, and his arrival from North America to wield to fight his Peninsular War, and this is basically just alluding to the manifestation of the father character having arrived in Ireland and also the dream world. And you can see in this sentence quite a lot of references to Irish culture and the Irish language. There is also an allusion to Shem and Sean in the three words Gem or Shen. And also there's a lot of allusions to water, because in James Joyce's schema, all of the characters are sort of supposed to be depicted as being rivers. And this is why Joyce refers to Sir Tristram's aquaface, so he's basically being very elusive and metaphysical. The next sentence alludes to the fall of Finnegan and compares him to Humpty Dumpty having fallen from a wall. There is also the first lightning word. These appear at numerous points in the book to mark new sections of the dream, and also sections of Vico's schema of human history, which the book is modelled on. And I should also point out the reference to the River Liffey, which is a manifestation of ALP, and it is a common archetype in the course of the novel. Great, so we've now covered very briefly the first three paragraphs. Obviously, I've missed a lot, And I'm just going to now speed up and point out a few highlights from the rest of the chapter, and hopefully after you finish this video you can check it out yourself if you haven't already, and see what else you can pick up, because there really are endless interpretations to be made from this book. The next two paragraphs refer to Finnegan as being a giant, namely Big Mr. Finnegan of the Stuttering Hand, and there's also a reference to him finning again. So that's basically why Finnegan is called Finnegan, is because he's finning over and over again. He's ending and he's caught in the cycle of history, and so he keeps dreaming and dreaming and never being able to wake up. If you hadn't noticed so far, when reading Finnegans Wake, you really have to pay attention to the pronunciation of words. In fact, some sentences might only make sense when read aloud, and this is partly because Joyce was almost legally blind when writing it, so he was really thinking about how things sound rather than how they look on the page. I'm just going to run through a few paragraphs now and very briefly give you an impression of their content, so that when you tackle the rest of the chapter by yourself, you can understand some of the parts and not be completely confused. In this section, the narrator takes the reader on a guide through a fictional museum called the Willingdon Museum, and there's a lot of references to random events from history, for example, the Battle of Waterloo, and loads of different stuff in this section that you could probably interpret for years. So it's very confusing, but it's basically a museum of world history. There's also this section where Jute and Mutt, which are, I think, manifestations of Shem and Sean, have a sort of discussion, but it's very incomprehensible, and that's the point, that they don't really understand each other and they're talking past each other. And this kind of alludes to the nightmare of history that the novel is trying to portray. The Prank Queen episode is an example of Joyce using real history and working into the fictional events of his novel. It's actually based on the Irish story of Grace O'Malley showing up at Howth Castle and hoping to spend the night there, but having been refused, kidnapping the Earl of Howth's heir. But in this case, the Earl of Howth is called something like Jarl Van Hoother, and Grace O'Malley is called the Prank Queen. So it's very interesting how Joyce works real life historical figures into the events of Finnegans Wake and sort of makes them manifestations of the characters of the novel. So of course the word wake in the title doesn't only refer to literal waking up, but also Finnegan's funeral. And we have here one scene where Finnegan is basically lying in a coffin, and the Dubliners are encouraging him to stay put in it and trying to persuade him by pointing out the bad weather outside and saying he's better off there. And this is largely symbolic of Finnegan staying asleep to the cycles of history and lost and a drunkard in his life. And so one of the main themes of the novel is enlightenment, and so the wake of the title is also kind of referring to waking up to the reality of existence. So we'll skip now to the last two paragraphs of the book, and there's a couple of interesting points to be made here. Firstly, there is an allusion to the last line of the book with the sentence, "There'll be bluebells blowing in salty sepulchres the night she signs her final tear, the end." And this is basically an allusion to the fact that the book ends with the word "the." So it's very interesting that there's such a prominent reference to the last section of the book right at the beginning. And there's also a word here, or two words, anastasis, which is both a reference to ALP and the Greek word anastasis, resurrection, basically referring to the fact that at the end of the book, the protagonist and all of the characters will wake up and be able to change or do whatever they want to in real life, just like we'll go through when we sleep and wake up. And there's a few interesting sections in the last paragraph. Finnegan and HCE is compared to a salmon being cycled round a water cycle. And there is a line which refers to the hubbub caused in Edinburgh. And this is obviously alluding to the fact that this is largely an allegory of Genesis and the fall that took place there in the Bible. So, to this extent, it's a humorous reference to Genesis, and also the fact that this book is going to reenact cycles of history on the scale of a work such as the Bible, but obviously in a much more comedic and avant-garde kind of way. Great, well, thanks so much for watching, and I hope you learned something about Finnegans Wake. Do let me know if you'd like a second video on the second chapter. I am considering making one, but it just depends on the reception of this video. And obviously, Finnegans Wake is kind of antithetical to short summaries such as this, so making this video alone was kind of a challenge. In any case, thanks again for watching, and cheers. I'll see you next time.